Let's open our business ethics and action texts to the environmental ethics chapter, which is chapter 15, page 345. And I know you haven't read this yet, so I'm going to go ahead and talk this introductory case. Okay, I commend it to you for reading maybe after you've completed your papers over the weekend. This is a very famous case because it's the world's worst industrial disaster. And the structure of it is also very classic. There have been countless similarly structured cases over the years and decades that look just like this. Okay, so the worst industrial disaster in the history of the world took place on the night of the 2nd of December, 1984, at the Union Carbide India plant, a subsidiary of Union Carbide USA. It occurred in the city of Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, in central India. The direct cause of the tragedy was the leakage of 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, a gas used to make pesticides. Cocktails of deadly gases began drifting in clouds through the densely populated city streets. As a consequence, about 7,000 people died. In the following days and months, thousands of people waited for help in the streets, in their homes, and in the overcrowded hospitals. Up to a total of 20,000 lost their lives during the following years. In addition, 20,000 were severely harmed and 800,000 were affected. Okay, this is a classic case study, and it's classic because the decisions made by the executives of Union Carbide India and Union Carbide USA were for the classic reasons. Okay, they made the decisions that they made about cutting corners on safety and about building this factory, the plant, in a crowded area. They made the decision to not include redundant safety mechanisms and to skimp and cut corners on various different emergency protocols. They made it for one reason, and that reason was cost savings. Okay, they did it for the sake of saving themselves money and improving their margins. And the cost savings worked for a while as a strategy, until it didn't. This is a structure that gets repeated in business and the environment cases countless times. We're going to be looking in the course of this mini module on the relationship between business and the environment at another famous case, the BP case, the Macondo oil fields well blowouts, the Deepwater Horizon rig, which happens just out here off in the Gulf Coast. And basically in that case as well, the executives made their decisions for the sake of cost savings. And they got away with it for a while until they didn't. And when they didn't, it was catastrophic. Okay, now I suspect that what Union Carbide India was doing, and I have no evidence of this, I'm just shooting from the hip here, but I suspect that what Union Carbide India was doing was a standard kind of cost savings strategy among chemical plants in India. In other words, I suspect that their competitors were doing similar things. Just like I have always suspected that BP's Gulf Coast drilling competitors were probably always doing similar things. Okay, it is true that the horrible disaster that killed all these people was a tail risk event with a very low probability. And it is true also that in business you can often get away for a while with skimping and cutting corners on security and safety measures when you're dealing with low risk events, tail risk events even, that are that low in probability. But when they do happen, they are horrific, and the BP oil disaster nearly brought the company to its knees. An international conglomerate with a 100-year history was almost destroyed by it. I don't know whether Union Carbide was almost destroyed by this. It's a little bit more of a dated case. But I suspect that the amount that they had to pay out in litigation and the lost revenue and all that was deeply damaging to the company. I want to use this Bhopal case as a springboard for talking more generally about topics having to do with business and the environment. Okay, so we're now moving on to a second point, just some general introductory comments on the topic of business and the environment. At this point in history, almost everyone agrees, with a few exceptions, but almost everyone agrees that it is a good idea to preserve and protect the environment when you conduct your business each day. In other words, that's a good goal for you to have for your business, is to do right by the environment. There's not much dispute on this point. There are disputes about the particulars, disputes about whether global warming is taking place, disputes about whether this particular strategy of canceling the Keystone Pipeline, or this particular strategy of limiting drilling off the coast or something like that is a good strategy. There are disputes about those particulars, but they're not disputes about the end goal of preserving and protecting the environment in the course of our business dealings. However, the devil is in the details on this particular issue. And what you see on this issue is numerous companies who see at a theoretical level, at a conceptual level, the necessity of preserving and protecting the environment, but when it comes down to it, and when they are involved in a competitive enterprise with others who are pursuing cost savings measures, you see widespread collective action problems. Okay, in other words, to just boil it down to a single point, businesses all in theory stand for preserving and protecting the environment, but in practice, they do their very best not to do so, because it harms their own finances. It is almost always cheaper to do what is environmentally damaging. Almost always, with very few exceptions. And so businesses find themselves in very difficult situations, day in and day out, where to do right by the environment will mean that others will get ahead of them in the enterprise. Okay, and this all traces back to some of the core commitments of capitalism. Okay, now I've shared in class that I'm a committed capitalist. It's been a long journey, but I am a committed capitalist at this point. I think that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But a capitalist system is a system that pits different participants against each other in a competitive enterprise, with the thought that by competing against each other, they will be motivated to find cheaper ways to bring products to market, more efficient ways to allocate resources, more innovative or creative ways to develop products or services. And in doing so, the whole will be benefited. The collective, the society will be benefited. So private vices, namely pursuing self-interest and pursuing the advancement of your own company and your own greed, will lead to public virtue, is the theory. Private vices will lead to public virtue, because we all get benefited whenever somebody out of greed seeks to pursue his own best financial interest in the way that he runs his company. However, The problem with this is that those competitive pressures also lead to dangerous and negative incentives, including incentives, as we've talked in class before about, incentives to pay weak workers, demographically disadvantaged workers, as little as possible, incentives to be predatory on vulnerable customers, and in this case, incentives to cut corners when it comes to preserving and protecting the environment. Okay, and without a doubt, these problems go all the way down to a structural level. And the structural issue is the capitalist system privileges competition, and that means if you compete well against opponents, quote unquote opponents, right, others who are in the same business enterprise as you are, then you can win financially. And to compete well and to win often means cutting costs in ways that do long-term damage to your cultural and environmental surroundings. Okay, now I have a lot more to say about that, and I'm going to expand on that. We're going to talk about some potential solutions in the face of these structural difficulties. But I want to stop and ask if there are questions about the Bhopal case or comments or reflections on any of the things I've said about the topic of business and the environment so far. Okay. Generally speaking, business has a bad reputation in the culture when it comes to protection of the environment, with a few exceptions. Okay, there are some exceptions, but generally speaking, maybe because the media focuses on environmental disasters, maybe because businesses have often actually been hypocritical. Generally speaking, business has a bad reputation on these kinds of topics. And generally speaking, also, you'll see in practice all sorts of businesses that virtue signal. Even today, some leading businesses will virtue signal on the environmental topic and in practice actually do nothing, or even do environmentally damaging things. Because in practice, it's not in their self-interests to preserve and protect the environment. Well, virtue signaling, so by that I just mean that they present the appearance of environmental preservation and protection, while in fact doing precisely the opposite. Okay, now, in order to understand this topic and in order to talk about potential solutions to this topic, I think it's good if we step back and we look at what we're aiming at here. Okay, and I want to make it clear at the outset that my assumption is that all or almost all of us think that a business should be conducted in a way that doesn't do damage to the environment. Okay, that's going to be my background assumption here. But I want to be clear, I want to make something clear at the outset. I'm not disputing and saying that that should be our assumption, or that is my assumption, and that should be my assumption. I'm not disputing the fact that there are all sorts of misinformation stories that get spread about what's actually doing damage to the environment or what's not. I'm not disputing that, okay? A lot of the stuff that gets thrown around on the global warming topic, for instance, is hokey science on both sides. A lot of it's hokey. Whenever an issue becomes that political, everybody is motivated to fudge the data. That's the way it works. Okay, regardless of your political opinion, everybody on all sides starts fudging data. So I'm not disputing that there are discrepancies and disagreements about details. What I am saying is probably our working assumption should be that some sort of preservation and protection of the environment should be our overall goal. One goal in the course of our conduct of business. If you look on page 347, we're going to do a big picture look, very briefly, at some of the potential stances that business could take vis-a-vis the environment. And we're going to do so from a Christian perspective. Okay, so on page 347, we see some nice general framing comments here in the book. Human beings and nature are independent. Interdependent. Humans take food, air, water, and raw materials from the natural environment and deposit waste in it. Each generation receives the environment as a legacy from preceding generations and will in turn pass it on to their children. As noted, sustainable development takes place when the responsibility towards future generations is borne in mind and people act as stewards of natural resources. Okay, the issue of business and the environment centers, first of all, at a theoretical level on what we should be aiming at, what business persons should be aiming at in thinking about environmental topics. And if you turn the page to 349, our text begins discussing that issue by listing several different potential worldviews that one could take with respect to the environment. Okay, and the first one is Dominative Anthropocentrism. And we'll talk about that and its characteristics and its weaknesses for starters. So this approach, the text says, takes the human being as not only being at the center of the universe, but also possessing an absolute right to dominate any non-human creature on the planet. Human individuals are seen as autonomous beings, endowed with knowledge and the power to dominate the earth for their own use and a nearly unlimited right to do so. This approach has been prevalent in business for years, supported by the belief that the technological impact on nature could be easily absorbed, and by a cultural context in favor of the accumulation of wealth and an immoderate consumerism. Okay, this is actually a philosophically respectable view, okay? It is definitely philosophically respectable. It has branched out from Christian roots, but it does have roots in Christian teachings about the specialness of human beings and the distinction between human beings and the rest of nature. Okay, but it's branched out from these roots, and this is a philosophical perspective now that says that what matters most when it comes to issues of business and the environment is humans. And if humans can be benefited, if humans ultimately are benefited, or if humans are damaged, that is what should be our primary consideration in thinking about how business should operate in particular circumstances. Again, like I said, it's a very philosophically respectable approach. Okay, it's also, though, an approach that lends itself very naturally to self-serving business interests. Okay, so it's definitely in the interests of businesses that want to, expand their operations and business persons who want to grow wealthy to subscribe to a view of the environment that says that humans matter most. And when the chips are down and it's humans versus the natural world in our cost-cutting decisions, humans should win. Okay, it's certainly in the interests of business to do that. And honestly, I've been around enough in life to see that a lot of people choose the views that they choose because it is in their self-interest to do so, not for objective philosophical reasons. Okay, so this is a very respectable view, without a doubt. The anthropocentric view is very respectable. And like I said, it has Christian roots. Okay, but it's also a view that I think could be easily abused by virtue of the fact that it is in the interests of business persons to take this view because it's going to help them out financially to do so. Okay, and to hide behind the wall or the veneer of this view. What would this view look like in practice? Well, if you think back to an earlier case this semester, let's just take the case of Shell's Brent Spar buoy. The way an anthropocentric thinker would think about that is Shell should do whatever is going to be to the benefit of humans. Okay, because humans matter most when it comes to ethical topics. Humans matter more than other kinds of entities. So Shell should do whatever is to the benefit of humans. If sinking the Brent Spar to the bottom of the ocean does damage to fishing habitats that humans use, then that's probably something that Shell ought not to do. However, if sinking the Brent Spar to a particular spot in the ocean can be done with relatively little impact on the parts of the ocean that humans are using, then because of the cost savings measures that such an enterprise can accomplish, it might be justifiable. Okay, so the anthropocentric view says if you trace everything back to the impact on humans, then you are engaging in the right decision-making process and thinking about how we should approach the environment as business persons. Trace it all back to the impact on humans, because humans are the ones who matter most ethically. Okay, and let me just strengthen this view a little bit further. If you think about human morality, it's clearly such a central part of who and what we are. Okay, and it has been, as far as we know, since the history of humans began. The idea that there are certain things that we should or shouldn't do, and that there are certain ways we should treat others and other ways that we shouldn't treat others. It's something that's central to who and what we are. But it seems also to be a singularly human thing. Okay, there don't seem to be other creatures that share this particular phenomenon of morality. Okay, the lions feed on the antelope. The lions don't stop and hold therapy groups about whether or not they should be feeding on innocent antelope, right? They don't, remember that scene in Finding Nemo with the sharks who say, like, fish are friends, right? Friends not food, right? It's funny. It's a great scene. I love that movie. It's funny because animals don't do that. It's a human thing to stop and think about whether we should take the lives of innocents. No, the lions just eat the tasty antelope and don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. And so the anthropocentric view says, if you look at it, the trees obviously can't feel that they're being cut down. The animals don't have an experience of morality. We are the only ones who matter from a moral perspective on the anthropocentric view, because we alone have this phenomenon of morality. And we are more important than other species by virtue in part of having this phenomenon, and by virtue of whatever makes us humans in a way that gives us this experience of morality. Often you'll find the anthropocentric view grounded in Aristotelian thinking, especially the specialness of humans as rational creatures. That's something you'll often find as a background to this view. Okay, human beings alone have the ability to reason at a higher order level. Because of that, we have ontological superiority to other kinds of beings and are deserving of a privileged status whenever we come into conflict, or our interests come into conflict with the interests of other beings. Okay, so these kinds of considerations make this a very philosophically respectable view. Questions about the anthropocentric view? By the way, I don't know if you've ever thought at a reflective level about topics of business and the environment, or even just topics of environmental protection at all. But if you have done so, has anybody thought from an anthropocentric view before? Is that the view that you've taken?
I think they're all the positions before I decide which one exactly. But I think
we can talk about the other positions too.
I have many times come to the place where I've said okay, if at the end of the day I am deciding between saving a human life and saving the life of a tree,
right,
I'm going to save the human life.
Right.
And so
sure.
So that kind of sounds like
that's anthropocentric thinking.
Yeah.
It is.
So I think I guess I'm leaning towards that, but I'm not to the point where we can. Yeah, maybe I am for I'm not for destroying the environment.
Sure.
But I think what happens with the other cases, which that's why I want to clear the other cases, is that they think the environment is something that never changes.
Right.
And we want to restore it and never be able to touch it. And it's humanity has to live
Mm-hmm.
in the environment.
Oh, sure.
And it's
Yeah.
almost like
We're a part of it too.
the other scientists, well, I mean, learn about the other scientists, but they almost sound like they don't want humanity to interact at all.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah, and it's probably, Rebecca's right, it's probably only fair to you guys to like wait and tell you all the views before I ask if there's any sympathy for this one. And this is not the only view that says that humans should be privileged. There's actually another view that's going to be available to us that also says that humans, at least much or most of the time, should be privileged.
This one might sound a bit extreme, so I'm going to middle.
The middle road is often the safe
say
road when it
often,
comes to
can't say always, but then it's
ethics
that middle ground
topics.
again.
Yep, you're right. You're absolutely right. Okay, the biocentric view is an increasingly popular view. Okay, it's especially popular among vegetarians. It's especially popular among environmentally conscious utilitarians. Biocentrism. Yeah, I think I spelled that correctly. Okay, and let me just read here in the text. In stark contrast to the previous view, in biocentrism, human beings are not considered the center of the world. Instead, what is central is life, any kind of life. This position holds that all life forms not only possess intrinsic value, but are also equally valuable. And human beings are merely one animal species coexisting with others without any particular dignity to give them preeminence over other animals. In consequence, the well-being of all life must be taken into consideration. Okay, and this view has as its philosophical background the intuition that immediately comes to our minds as we look around us in the world, and we notice immediately that we are not alone and that there are all sorts of other beings that have the kinds of properties that we have: consciousness, the ability to move, the ability to think, that have life as an experience. Okay, and on this view, these other beings are worthy of ethical dignity as well. Okay, in fact, even to the point of equal ethical dignity with human beings. Why equal? Well, on this point, why equal, there is some disagreement, some divergence among adherents of this view. Perhaps the most common reason for the why equal question is that all life forms that at least pass a certain neurological level are capable of experiencing pleasure and pain. Not all can reason at our level, but certainly lower animals can experience pleasure and pain in deep ways, very deep ways. And on this view, the pleasure-pain backing for the biocentric view, animals other than us that have life are deserving of deep ethical respect because ethics is a function of the ability to experience pleasure and pain. Okay, the ability to experience some deep wrong being done to one's physical self means one has ethical value on this view. Now, before you just sort of dismiss this view, I think probably since most of us are coming from a Christian background, we're less sympathetic to this view. Before you just dismiss this view, think about that for a minute and think about how you would feel if you were capable of experiencing deep pleasure and pain and were dismissed as an ethical entity because you couldn't reason at a higher order level. There are some human beings who can't reason at a higher order level. Okay, and I think most of us would share the intuition that they are deserving of respect, maybe just as much as respect as those who can reason at a higher order level. Think about why you think that they are deserving of that respect. One reason for saying that they are deserving of equal respect is that they are members of the same species, a sort of a speciesist-based grounding for their ethical value. But another reason for saying they're deserving of equal respect is even though they might not be able to reason at a higher order level, still such human beings can always experience pleasure and pain in similar capacities as the rest of us. And so some would say that that's a reason for saying that they are equal in ethical value. Okay, so the biocentric view says that you should, in making your business decisions, privilege life, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should privilege human life. You should privilege whatever has consciousness, whatever is capable of movement and of the properties of life, growth, nutrition, etc. Okay, also available is an ecocentric view. This view is akin to the biocentric view, so it's joined at the hip, but it's different in an important way. The ecocentric view doesn't take as its point of ethical departure, the level at which it thinks that moral decisions should be made. It doesn't take as its point of ethical departure the life standard, but rather it takes the ecosystem as a whole as its point of ethical departure. Okay, so on this view, the center is not life itself, but the ecosystem or complete community of living organisms and the non-living materials of their surroundings functioning together as a unity. Humans, as with animals, are part of a complex ecosystem. While biocentrism concentrates on protecting the life of individual animals, ecocentrism focuses on the whole. From this perspective, environmental ethics consists of achieving an equilibrium of natural ecosystems. Thus, protecting a specific animal is not acceptable if this leads to serious ecological damage. Okay, on this view, what should be done, the stance you should take as a business person, is preservation and protection of the collective ecosystem, but not any particular species within it over and against any other species. So if a particular species, for instance, suppose you're a park ranger, and a particular species is an invasive species doing damage to the ecosystem. I don't know, say maybe somebody imports a species of goat. That goat thrives beyond its normal capacities and begins eating all the vegetation and leading to a decline in the populations of other animals who don't have access to that vegetation. Okay, you as the park ranger on the ecocentric view can maybe shoot some of the goats, eliminate at least a part of the goat population, maybe all of it, for the sake of the collective, for the sake of the whole, because it is the ecosystem as a whole that should be your unit of ethical operation. Now notice some of the key background assumptions that underlie the ecocentric view. And also notice some of the weaknesses as well. Okay, one assumption is that the ecosystem as a whole is good. And also, we can discern what that good is. Okay, this is a crucial assumption behind advocates, that lies behind the views of advocates of the ecocentric view. On the ecocentric view, it is possible for human beings not only to know that the ecosystem as a whole is a good, an entity that is good, but also to know and discern what they should do in order to preserve and protect that good. But notice that the ecosystem as a whole doesn't just go away, does it? Okay, if you dump toxic wastes in a river, the ecosystem does not cease to be. It just becomes different. It becomes a different ecosystem. Yeah, so that's a valid point. So it becomes a different ecosystem. And ecosystems are dynamic things. They change. They flourish. They decline. How is it that we know what's good for an ecosystem in any particular moment? Okay, often, actually, what humans do vis-a-vis the environment might have short-term damages while leading to long-term gains. And this is the sort of thing that the ecocentric views advocates tend to struggle with. Okay, so for instance, I personally think that mosquitoes are morally abhorrent. Okay, I don't think that there's like a morally solid justification for mosquitoes. Okay, just like I think that other species that prey upon urban settings where humans have, developed these compact, concentrated lives together tends to be less justifiable as species. Okay, so cockroaches flourish in cities where people live in close proximity because they're predatory upon humans. Rats, starlings, those birds that congregate at night and poop all over the parking lots. They're dependent upon the human habitat. Now, would the ecosystem be better off without these things? Well, my first intuition is yes, but my second thought is, how do I know? How do I know what's good for the ecosystem? Isn't it arrogant for me to presume that I know which direction the ecosystem should take? Now, a lot of the advocates of the ecocentric view would say, well, it's not arrogant at all. The best direction that the ecosystem should take should be whatever direction it would take normally in the absence of human involvement. Okay, that's a rather standard response that an advocate of the ecocentric view would take. But even there, the absence of human involvement can often lead to destructive paths. So in the absence of human involvement, it's certainly possible for destructive species to take over a particular ecosystem and kill all the other species. And human beings, I would think, could do good by maintaining equilibrium in such a situation, preventing the invasive species from doing damage. Okay, and so some advocates of the ecocentric view say, well, the good is not necessarily whatever the ecosystem would do in the absence of humans. The good is rather whatever exists now. That's the good. Okay, so on this view, humans should involve themselves, this interpretation of ecocentrism, humans should involve themselves in the environment, but for the purpose of maintaining stasis, maintaining the status quo. But even this seems hard to justify. Because obviously environments are incredibly dynamic things. And for humans to presume that it is their responsibility to maintain the status quo, a sort of a snapshot for whenever they started maintaining the status quo, like we're going to keep it always, forever, like that. That seems awfully quick. Seems awfully arrogant, even. Okay, so the ecocentric view does face certain challenges and objections. Like, how do you know what the good is for the environment? Is the good maintaining the status quo? Is the good removing humans from it? Is the good some combination of something else? How do you know what is good for the environment? And how do you act on it? Okay, but it is an increasingly popular view. It's especially popular, biocentrism and ecocentrism are especially popular among people who think that humans take too high a view of themselves and their place in the world. Okay? So Christianity for a long time has taught that, since its founding, it's taught that human beings have a special place. It comes from the Imago Dei assumption that human beings are different than everything else in the environment because human beings have a special designation given to us, an imprimatur given to us by God. Okay, and that's been Christian teaching for a long time. The biocentric and ecocentric views are very attractive to people who want to reject that.
So we go so extreme that humanity is like a pest.
Yeah, that's the view of a lot of people these days, is that we would be better off, the world would be better off without humans, actually. It's kind of a radical view, but it's an increasingly popular view, actually. It's a view that you'll often hear from advocates of birth control who say we need to have few or no human beings because humans just do damage wherever they go. Without a doubt, humans do damage wherever they go, but humans also do a lot of good.
It just seems contradictory because you're trying to make an environment to cause movement around humans to do something.
Yeah.
When it sounds like we shouldn't be doing anything.
Yeah, I know.
Would the biocentrism view, would that kind of be kind of ideological because it comes with that idea? Could you say the ecocentrism is kind of consequential, like trying to avoid damage to all cause?
Yeah, the biocentric view is more deontological. Yeah, so the biocentric view asserts most of the time that what's right is whatever will preserve and protect life. Okay, especially embodied conscious life. That's what they mostly focus on. And that's a deontological way of thinking. So, consequences, what may, let's preserve and protect life. The ecocentric view says what matters most is not the preservation or protection of life. What matters most is a particular state of affairs to be brought about. So that's consequentialist in its thinking. Deontological and consequentialist are the categories we should conceive of these in. So the biocentric and ecocentric views then are increasingly held by people who want to reject the Christian assumption that humans are special, that humans have a special place. Okay, and like I said earlier, the anthropocentric view comes out of that way of thinking, that humans have a special place, but it's not necessarily at this point a Christian view, since it's also held by secular advocates of reason and of rationality as being a distinguishing human characteristic. So its roots are not just Christian, they're also actually Greek as well. Okay, the biocentric and ecocentric views are increasingly popular. Let me pause and ask if there are questions or comments about any of these views. Go over the business and the environment topic. My opening comments about it? Yes. Yes, I sure can. Yeah, so the opening point that I wanted to make was that at this point there's basically consensus about the topic of environmental preservation and protection. So you really won't find any business persons who are going to say we shouldn't do something for the sake of preserving and protecting the environment. However, in practice, it doesn't tend to turn out that way. Because in practice, you get a bunch of people who virtue signal while actually doing precisely the opposite. It's a collective action problem. Remember when we talked about collective action problems earlier in the semester? Okay, collective action problems are problems where it is in the interest of the collective that something happen, but it is precisely not in the interest of individuals that happen. Yeah, I think we talked about it in the context of bribery. Okay, so the collective sees it as being in its interest that the environment be preserved and protected. We'll say this arrow represents that interest. But the individual business person and the individual business sees it as being in their own interests to do precisely the opposite. Okay, it is in the interest of the individual to defect from the collective interest in order to maximize his or her wealth gains. It is in the interest of the individual business to increase its margins by skimping on its environmental filtering system. Okay, and the collective action problem is just this. How do we align these and make it in the interest of the individual to do what is in the interest of the collective? How can we alter the motivation, natural motivation of the individual so that the individual too wants to do what is in the interest of the collective? Does that help a little bit, Isabella?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Maybe that makes it a little bit clearer. For sure. We're going to talk about some practical strategies for doing that in the course of our module. It's kind of a mini module on business and the environment. Other questions? Let's take a break, and then when we come back, we'll look at the stewardship view, which is a view that we've already looked at in a different context, but we will talk about it here, and we'll also look at a case study today. Okay, so you guys are on a 2 or 3 minute break.